So Irina Metzler is a former lecturer in medieval history with a PhD in history of medicine and a long-standing interest in Tolkien's work through a personal journey from fandom to scholarly engagement. With a number of Oxenmoot and seminar talks, she had a previous Tolkien seminar paper on Tolkien and disability published in the Peter Rose series. It is also recorded and available on YouTube. I would really recommend watching it if you haven't already. Welcome, Irina.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can indeed. We can hear
Brilliant.
you and see you.
Just say, it is actually possible, allegedly, for me to share my screen because somehow I managed to get Zoom to work. So I'm just going to try and do that now.
Okay.
If that's okay. Right. Let me just see. No, it looks like it's having problems. Bear with me.
If it would be easier, we do have your PowerPoint here. We can run the PowerPoint from here.
It probably is easier because it's asking me to do all sorts of funny settings.
Okay, absolutely fine. I'm just going to jump to our tech team. Is it okay to load Irina's paper?
While you're fiddling with that, I just want to kind of two apologies. One, I am absolutely gutted. I was so looking forward to being in Leeds in person, but thanks to the bill of a car mechanic, basically I just can't afford to be there in person. So much as I'm not a fan of Zoom, it's really useful at times. It has its place. And the other thing is, if you hear a roar kind of in the background or just general background noise, unfortunately, with impeccable timing, the Wales annual air show is taking place and the red arrows happen to be on right for the half hour or the 20 minutes that I've got speaking time. Great, you've got the screen up. Okay, so I'm trying to look at links between ancient Egypt and something that Tolkien as a Catholic would have been also familiar with, medieval theology, and how this plays out in Numenor. Next slide, please. Thank you, great. So some of the themes to be looked at, I'll just rush through these, are what I kind of call the forensic approach. What's the evidence in scare quotes, sorry. So what have we got in Tolkien's actual writings? Before then, in part two, looking at, you might say, the value added analysis. How does thought from real world theology and eschatology, which means the sort of signs of the last things, the last days, the resurrection, how that all ties in with Tolkien's legendarium. Next slide, please. Thank you. So without further ado, I've kind of collated everything that seems to be apposite to the theme of burial, not necessarily in the order of the publications or the order in which Tolkien wrote things, but in the order in which they seem to fit in with the development of the secondary world. So we know in Númenor, at the foot of the central mountain Menil Tama, you have the tombs of the kings. Note this just relates to kings. There is nothing I could find about the burial practices for so-called ordinary people. It all seems to relate, as is proper for high fantasy, to the people of high status. There's a little bit more detail. It's along the crest of the southwestern ridge, on the road approaching the mountain. You get to a shallow valley. The valley is actually named as, I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, Númenor, the Valley of the Tombs. Note how similar that is to the Valley of the Kings that we all have heard of from Egyptian archaeology. And at the head of the valley, same as with the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, you have chambers cut into the rock. So the tombs of the kings and queens of Numenor, like the tombs of the pharaohs. And then as Númenorian history progresses, we find that the rot begins to set in kind of halfway through with King Tar and Calaman. And this is the fear of death grew ever darker upon them, and they delayed it, the fear of death, by all means they could. They began to build great houses for their dead, while their wise men labored unceasingly to discover if they might the secret of recalling life, or at least of prolonging of men's days. Yet they achieved only the art of preserving incorrupt the dead flesh of men, and they filled all the land with silent tombs in which the thought of death was enshrined in the darkness. So that is quite a negative portrayal. It's sort of showing a society on the cusp of losing interest in life and expending more energy and resources and thought into death. There's also a sense of what you might say sort of medieval alchemy, the wise men laboring to discover secrets, the philosopher's stone, the thing that gives you immortality. So there's a lot going on there in just this one little quote. Next slide, please. And thank you. So Tolkien himself takes note of that in a letter of 1951. He says that the desire to escape death produced a cult of the dead, lavished wealth and art on tombs and memorials. That is very much the idea that archaeology had of Egypt until relatively recently. If you ask more, should we say, modern Egyptologists, they will say that it's not so much a cult of the dead, it's actually a cult of life, because the whole idea was to kind of have everlasting life. But that's kind of, I suppose, going beyond this topic. So anyway, by the time we have the downfall of Numenor, with the last king, the last ruler, Pharazôn the Golden. Note the similarity between Pharazôn and Pharaoh of Egypt. Obviously, you know, loads of people have noticed that. So by this time, 24 kings and queens had ruled, and they slept now in their deep tombs under the mountain of Nelatama, lying upon beds of gold. So you've got that materialistic element, the importance of matter, not just of bodies, but of precious materials itself. So then in the last days of Numenor, when the Númenoreans in effect colonize areas of Middle-earth, they're degenerate to the point that there's human sacrifice on their altars of the captured men, which takes place in temples, which they've built in their fortresses, but also in these fortresses are great tombs. So you can see the transition from the island to practices now in Middle-earth. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So we're now onto the afterlife of Númenorian burial practices in Gondor, and yes, that is pun intended. We've basically got the scenes relating to Denethor and Faramir. Denethor, in his madness, sort of says, "There's no long sleep of death embalmed." So he's turning against the tradition. "We will burn like heathen kings before ever a ship sailed hither from the west," etc., etc. So again, there's a tension between what you would expect from Númenorian practice carried forward into Gondor, and Denethor deliberately turning against that. The kind of walk, the funeral procession, is described in Return of the King out of the White Tower as if to a funeral. And then you get a description which is actually very, very like the valley at the foot of the mountain in Numenor, and like the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. Going down to the valley, a winding road, descending in many curves to a narrow land under the shadow of the mountain Mindoluin, where stood the mansions of the dead kings and of their stewards. Again, it's just mentioning the, shall we say, higher echelons of society, kings and stewards, no mention about ordinary inhabitants of Gondor. And then these mansions are the houses and domed tombs of bygone kings and lords. Next slide, please. Description of getting there. The silent street, their feet echoing, Rathdinen, between pale domes and empty halls. So it's this very, very funereal image. And there are images of men long dead. It's not quite said what kind of images these are. Dimly seen were many rows of tables carved of marble, that's the tables, and upon each table lay a sleeping form, hands folded, head pillowed upon stone. And I emphasize it's the tables of marble because it's not quite clear whether these forms are the effigies carved or the embalmed bodies of former stewards, as Hammond and Scull have noticed. So is it like catacombs where the bodies are displayed, or is it, as we would more expect, you know, some sort of carved statue, etc. Next slide, please. So that's the kind of bad death with the madness of Denethor. You have right at the end of Lord of the Rings and right at the end of the fourth age going now, you've got what in medieval practice is called ars moriendi, the art of dying. You're going to have a good death and a bad death. Denethor is the bad death. Here is an example of the good death, death of Aragorn. Knowing his time had come, like the good Númenorian kings of before, Aragorn went down to the House of Kings in Rathdinnen and laid himself down on the bed that had been prepared for him. So he knows his time has come, he's doing the right thing. Aragorn falls into sleep, the everlasting sleep, with Arwen holding his hand. It's all very romantic in a macabre sort of way. And the key thing is a great beauty was revealed in him. So this is as he is dying or already dead. All who came after looked upon him in wonder. And there's a sort of triple image. They see the grace of his youth, the valor of his manhood, and the wisdom, majesty of his age. It's like the three ages of man of medieval kind of storytelling. So that's all combined in this almost idealized image, the splendor of the kings of men in glory undimmed, very much like, which I'll be mentioning in a minute, like the bodies of the saints in medieval Christianity. And Tolkien actually says free will, Aragorn had free will when he felt it time to do so. Therefore, Aragorn is an exemplary man who should die voluntarily before being compelled. The emphasis is Tolkien's in the letters. And again, Hammond and Scull in their Reader's Companion note Aragorn's submission to his destiny is written in a positive light by Tolkien, so in contrast to Denethor. Next slide, please. So just to kind of sum this up, the connection with Gondor and Egypt, I'll rattle through this quickly because I'll probably run out of time. Tolkien himself makes the comparisons, this is the central kind of quote here, in his letter, famous letter in 1958 to Rona Beer, the Númenoreans of Gondor are best pictured in, say, Egyptian terms. In many ways, they resembled the Egyptians, the love of and power to construct gigantic and massive, and their great interest in ancestry and tombs. And then, of course, the crown of Gondor, which was the image that I used at my title slide. Then there's, of course, you know, further critics sort of view, John Garth, and also citing Murray Smith, about the obsession with monumental tombs and the similarity between the Valley of the Tombs and the Egyptian Valley of the Kings. And next slide, please. So how does this obsession with preserving the body come in? There is, well, not obscure, but a sort of very late found typescript, now published in Nature of Middle-earth, which relates to man bodies being deserted by the Feas, the kind of spirit. They are made to be the houses of Fea that, once they are severed from the body, never return. The body then has no function, and the shock of the separation is greater, and for the most part it soon decays and passes away. And then Tolkien himself had this asterisk and this kind of footnote in saying the body doesn't always decay. Men report that the bodies of some of their dead long maintain their coherence and even sometimes endure in fair form, as if they slept only. So that is the kind of thing that happened to Aragorn. And that is also the kind of thing that, as a medievalist, I am familiar with when concerning notions of sainthood. And this is what Carl Hostetter, editor of Nature of Middle-earth, mentions, the incorruptibility of the flesh. And then, you know, anyone who's familiar with Catholic Christianity will come across the so-called odor of sanctity, according to which the bodies of holy people are said to emit a fragrant smell, a sweet smell, generally like flowers. Next slide, please. So to medieval and Renaissance minds, this is a kind of emulation of paradise, because you need something extraordinary to preserve bodies in this world. And I've highlighted a text here by an Italian scholar, Piero Campari, who's written extensively on, you might say, anthropology, ethnography, but also religion, tying the two together. And I've highlighted in blue my kind of key text here: the embalming of corpses in medieval and Renaissance Christianity reflected the search for permanence and renewal through rebirth. It's an ancient dream that the human world vainly sought to propitiate by simulating the appearance of longevity in the cadavers of the famous. This could apply almost to a T to Númenor and Gondor, because, as I said, it seems to relate only to the kings and stewards, and very little mention about ordinary people. Next slide, please. So turning to medieval notions, the sort of era Tolkien was writing in, I found I've deliberately used an older text here. If you look underneath, it's something published in 1930 in a sort of popularized medieval history. And I've deliberately chosen that and not something written in the last couple of years to show you what sort of literature would have been around in Tolkien's time, what he would have been familiar with, and how, should we say, prevalent the medieval Catholic thought would have been at his time. So various quotes here relating to what happened to the bodies of saints. They're all found incorrupted. Rattling through these, umpteen years after the burial, the saints' bodies are uncovered, and it's as if they had died yesterday. And the interesting thing to note is the last one here: the body of Saint Etheldreda, found uncorrupted, and a wound in her neck which had been open at her burial was healed, so that nothing but the scar remained. And then, of course, the mention of the sweet smell coming from the coffin, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the origins of these notions? They go back to biblical texts. In Psalms 16, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One, that's Jesus according to prophecy, to see corruption. And neither did Christ's flesh see corruption in Acts in the New Testament. So it's the notion that the whole body, in Latin corpus totum, is also an uncorrupted body, corpus incorruptum, at least as far as the bodies of saints are concerned. Saints emulating the life of Christ, therefore similar to Christ. And by the time you get to the Middle Ages proper, just one out of dozens of quotes I've come across from St. Anselm, who was born in 1033. He says, in heaven, after the resurrection, there shall be none who are blind, lame, or defective. So all physical imperfections are removed. Such defects, though, will remain as would redound to the glory of the elect. So saints like Etheldreda will retain the scars of their martyrdom, but for everybody else, there is no pain, discomfort, or unease in the body. Next slide, please. Sorry, you'd gone ahead a bit, but it doesn't matter. I'm sure everyone will have read those bits about what happens to the body. So I'll talk about the images. Pardon the quality of these. I had file format problems. The medieval notion is that no matter what happens to the body in this world, at the resurrection, bodies will be resurrected perfectly. And you've got these rather fascinating images of animals. Top left, you can see what looks like a bear or some sort of a big beast, returning bits of body parts. So even if someone had died in this world and their body had been eaten by wolves, bears, whatever, at the resurrection, the body is made whole again. Therefore, sorry, if you could have the next slide, please. Just to show you some more images to see how widely prevalent this idea is, and also in different media. Also as wall paintings accessible to a wider audience than just, you know, learned people looking at books. There is an idea that because the resurrection of the body is total and incorrupted in heaven, there is almost like no need for embalming or any of these sort of practices, because at the resurrection, everything is made right again anyway. Final slide then, please. Thanks. So just to wrap this up, the way I would interpret it is that with the two contrasting approaches you've got between the bodies of the dead in Egypt and the bodies of the dead in the Middle Ages, tied into Numenor as Egypt and kind of this worldly practices, are that there's almost like a, Tolkien would probably not have been fond of morals, but there is a moral message in it, that the earlier civilization becomes corrupted themselves, which is evidenced in how much more they obsess about preventing corruption in bodies, yet at the same time, they are becoming morally corrupted. So whereas resurrection in medieval Christianity would correct, in inverted commas, any defects or deficits, it reduces the importance of physicality. Numenor and then Gondor, in their degeneracy, focus on exactly that physicality. Hence, my final sort of conclusion, with ever greater pursuit of corporeal immortality, that parallels an ever steeper moral decline. And then, of course, hence ending up in the downfall of Numenor. Thank you very much. I hope I've kept to time, and I'm happy for the questions.
Thank you very much. Hello. Yeah, that's coming through. Right. Thank you very much, Irina, for such spectacular. And also, it's really useful, I think, always to kind of go back to the text that Tolkien would have been aware of and what he would have read. It just helps us kind of get into his mindset a little bit and think about, you know, what might have sparked his ideas and all of that. So thank you so much for bringing that material to us today. Okay, so we're going to move on to a Q&A. So last time I did take a question from the in-person audience, so I'm going to go online. Let's see what we got. So if you haven't already, then please do share your questions through the Q&A function. Oh, okay, so you've preempted Denny's question. Okay, right. So we've got a question from Jessica. An interesting parallel are the seated kings and queens of Charn compared to waxworks and drawn by Baines. These would seem to be the real bodies, as the final one is Queen Jadis, who comes to life in C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. Oh, hello.
Sorry, you can't have a Zoom thing without a cameo appearance by either pets or children, can't you? Sorry, that was a cat.
I did think I heard a few like ahs, so I think your cat has a few fans over here. Okay, so yeah, it was just Jessica's question about the comparison between the kings and queens of Charn, and then you've got the C.S. Lewis's Queen Jadis in The Magician's Nephew.
Wow, okay. I wasn't expecting any questions on Lewis. Gosh, I'm trying to remember that now. It's ages since I read that, but I think I vaguely remember the hall with all the statues lined up and the faces become more and more harsh and magisterial. And anyway, I think it's a really good question, because there does seem to be, if I think about it now, there does seem to be a kind of like line of, again, moral corruption and descent in Lewis's stories. And as to the effigies, I mean, I would think that the figures lying on top of the tombs in Númenor and Gondor are the embalmed, if not mummified, bodies of the kings and then later the stewards, which, you know, yeah, it is macabre, and it is an obsession with physicality, and hence not something that kind of ties in with both Lewis's and Tolkien's spirituality in that Christian sense. That's more most I can say to that, really.
Yeah, absolutely fine. It was a really interesting answer. Thank you very much. Okay, so back to our in-person audience. Would anyone like to? There we go. Hand straight up. Chap first, please.
Hi. Just thinking about the kind of practical chronology of influence that we're discussing, with the idea of Tolkien looking at the Egyptians as an influence on his creation of side of the text. Do you think that with him thinking about how his mythology fits into the real world, the descent into what like naturalized history, do you think that the pyramids, he's imagining the pyramids as a sort of a badly remembered race memory of Meneltama?
Sorry, it was difficult to hear that.
And then also the kind of marble statues on tombs in the medieval period and later, the Victorian sort of like presentations are like a badly remembered version of the ones in the history of Numenor.
I'll take it the other way around first. I'll do pyramids in a minute. But as to tombs, Victorian tombs, medieval tombs, marble statues, you get some interesting tombs. They're so-called cadaver tombs, mainly from, I think it's from the late 14th century onwards, 15th century, which have almost like a double decker. I don't know if you've seen me use my hands, with the body in its prime, statue on top, and then below that, the body as a rotting cadaver or even skeleton, which all ties in with a late medieval obsession with death, possibly something following the plague in the 14th century and great mortality. And, I mean, that's an entire paper in itself. But, certainly you get, more and more of these kind of funerary monuments. As to the pyramids, I had a question for Putri in her earlier paper about the mountain, the pyramid, mountain, center of the world. I think there is a link there. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping and joining various kind of Eurasian cultural tropes here. There is certainly an idea that a pyramid, same as the biblical Tower of Babel, is an emulation of a mountain trying to get closer to heaven. And if you have in, I think it's in Hindu and Buddhist mythology, you have the idea of Mount Meru, which I was wondering whether Merapi in Puti's paper is similar to Meru. It's the center of the world. It's also the seat of the gods, Mount Olympus from Greek myth. And you have, more or less globally, you have human structures trying to emulate the central mountain. So I'd say, yes, absolutely, pyramids probably are a mountain, and Tolkien's use of pyramids, central mountain, Meneltama, all of that melds in with, you might say, real world mythology. Yeah.